Most centrally, the court is literally shaped by the other branches. The Constitution requires that there be a Supreme Court and requires that it have a Chief Justice. How many justices? That's up to the other branches. Who they are, of course, is up to the other branches, right? They have to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So there is the sense in which the other branches literally create the court and staff it. Much of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is defined by Congress, by statute. The fact that the Supreme Court today has discretion over what cases it hears, the certiorari process, essentially in almost every case that the Supreme Court hears is because the court decided to hear that case. But that is a creature of statute. It wasn't always that way. There used to be appeals of right to the Supreme Court. Now there aren't, except in a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of cases. But Congress could reinstitute appeals of right. And that would have a huge impact on the court, because today the court hears 80, 90 cases a year at most. If you reinstitute appeals of right, it could shoot up into the hundreds, if not thousands of cases a year. And that would, of course, mean that how the court goes about doing its work would have to change radically. So in that regard, Congress's choices shape the court. But there's also the fact that the court, like any politically sensitive actor, responds to what's going on around it. So it's responsive to the fact that Congress could cut its budget if it doesn't like what it does, but even more subtly, it's responsive to the kinds of political winds that blow through the elected branches as well. So it's a more politically sensitive institution than we sometimes give it credit for, right? We like to think of it, and it likes to promote itself as something that stands outside the political process. In fact, you see justices saying this explicitly in their opinions, right? We stand outside of politics. But they don't. And there's reams of political science research about the fact that they don't, and about the ways in which they are perhaps slightly less sensitive to the politics of the day than the other institutions, but nevertheless over a broad swath of history, very much responsive to public opinion, to the way the political winds blow, to things like that.
What you see when you look at the long sweep of history is really a conversation between the three branches of the federal government. And the court started out clearly the weakest of the three branches, Congress clearly the strongest. I think today a lot of people would say the executive branch is now the strongest. And there are lots of ways in which the court is still the weakest. It doesn't have the power of the purse. It can't spend money in order to make people do things. And it doesn't have the power of the sword. It doesn't have its own army to make people do things. It relies on the other branches to do their work. And this goes right back to Marbury versus Madison. If the court doesn't think it has backup, it's going to hesitate and it's going to worry. And the court is always worried about getting too far away from what the majoritarian branches are willing to support, what it's going to do. And so it does sometimes move a little bit out of sync with some popular opinion, or it moves ahead of popular opinion in various ways. We like to say ahead, but that's what it thought it was doing in Roe, was moving ahead, and then it turned out popular opinion wasn't necessarily moving in that direction, and then it was excoriated for that. But I do think that there's a constant dance between what the justices think is going to be politically acceptable, but that they can still get away with, and what the other branches of government are doing. I think the justices are always worried about their legitimacy. They don't have the money and they don't have the military. What they have is their authority and their legitimacy. And that actually relies on popular perceptions of some neutrality. Whether those popular perceptions are true or not, the court has an interest in maintaining those perceptions because that's what gives it legitimacy.
Well, the confirmation process is what the court looks like in some sense. It's how we get the personnel that we have. And the confirmation process, I think, in almost every era, people have decried the confirmation process. You often hear people suggest that the confirmation process is sort of unusually nasty today or unusually partisan today. That's nonsense. George Washington had trouble getting some of his nominees confirmed, including some of his Supreme Court nominees were voted down by the Senate. The confirmation process has at some times been more friendly, more consensus-driven, and other times has been more conflictual. But there's no straight-line trajectory. It's ebbs and flows. and those ebbs and flows are driven by the larger politics. When you have a president who enjoys widespread public support, who commands majorities in the Senate, sometimes commands majorities in both houses of Congress, the nominees are going to have an easier time. When you have a president who is, low approval ratings, maybe doesn't control the Senate, then you're going to have a harder time. So it's not a coincidence that two of the presidents who had the most trouble getting their nominees confirmed were our first two presidents who came to the office because they were vice presidents and the president died. Right. So John Tyler, who was called His Accidency because he was the first vice president to become president when William Henry Harrison died, has the lowest success rate of any president in getting cabinet nominees confirmed. And then, of course, Andrew Johnson had tremendous trouble. Right, he's a war Democrat who becomes president upon Lincoln's death. The Congress is controlled by Republicans. The radical Republican wing is especially powerful. Of course, they don't want to confirm Johnson's nominees, and in fact, they don't want to allow him to fire Lincoln's nominees, which is why you get the Tenure of Office Act. So there's always been a politics around confirmation. Confirmation politics is driven by many of the same factors as any other form of politics. And sometimes that means sometimes it's nasty and sometimes it's nice.